Ellie, where were you when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated here on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel?
I was working in New York in the national headquarters of the American Civil Liberties Union, and I ran an organization that had the responsibility of recruiting law students and sending them to the South to help on civil rights work. So I had 10 law students that were in Memphis working with the sanitation strike and with the lawyers here. And I was in my office in Manhattan packing my briefcase to take a plane the next morning to Memphis because they had that march coming up within 2 or 3 days. And so I was there in my office, and my secretary came in, and she said, she had the radio on. She said that she had just heard that Dr. King had been shot in Memphis. And I sat at my desk stunned, and within about 10 minutes she came back out crying and said that he had died. And I finished packing very quickly and walked downstairs with her and put her in a taxi, and then I went over and took the Lexington uptown to Grand Central Station. And when I got off the train in Grand Central Station, no one was speaking to anybody. It was just tense and quiet, and you could cut the tension with a knife there. And I went on uptown to and shortly later that night, the rioting started in Harlem and in other parts of the country, and I did come on to Memphis the next day. And when I got here, the city was under martial law, and National Guard troops were throughout the city. And of course, the march did occur that Dr. King was to lead 2 days later, I think, on the 8th of April, and thousands of people were here. Mrs. King came with her children. I talked with Mrs. King when we brought her here for the dedication of the museum, and she told me the story that that some of her family members had urged her not to come to that march. They were fearful in the wake of the assassination, and that Harry Belafonte had called her and said, "Mrs. King, you've got to go." And that was what tipped the scales that caused her to come to Memphis and be in that march.
Judge Jeremy Bailey standing in front of the room where Dr. King was killed on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. Harry Belafonte takes the story from there. He was with Coretta Scott King at the King home in Atlanta on April 4th, 1968.
When Dr. King was murdered, I was in Atlanta in their home, and we separated ourselves from others who were there in the living room, and she said, "Would you come with me?" We went into the bedroom, and she said, "Help me select the clothes that we must dress him in." And it was a very private and a very remarkable thing, the intimacy of it with her. And as we were selecting the suits and the shirt and the tie and laying it out, she sat on the bed, and she the place where she had slept so often with her husband and all those memories. And I said, "What is it?" She says, "You know, I'm worried about where this is all going. I'm worried about the nation, the rage, the anger, and I need to know what to do." And we talked for a second, and I said to her, "You know, at this very moment in Memphis, thousands of sanitation workers are on hold because Dr. King was supposed to have been there tomorrow to lead that movement and to speak to the people. And before your husband, our leader, is put in his grave, if you have the will and the capacity to go down there tomorrow and stand up before those workers and let the world know that the movement has not been interrupted, that the process continues, and that all of us, as strong or as weak as we may be, will step into the breach and do what must be done." And she did.
Harry Belafonte remembering the days after King died. April 4th is also the anniversary of Dr. King's major address against the war in Vietnam. It was April 4th, 1967, a year to the day before King was assassinated. He gave it at Riverside Church here in New York.
These are the times for real choices and not false ones. We are at the moment when our lives must be placed on the line if our nation is to survive its own folly. Every man, if you may, and sending us all off on what in some circles has become a popular crusade against the war in Vietnam. I say we must enter that struggle, but I wish to go on now to say something even more disturbing. The war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit, and if we ignore this sobering reality, we will find ourselves organizing clergy and layman concerned committees for the next generation. They will be concerned about Guatemala and Peru. They will be concerned about Thailand and Cambodia. They will be concerned about Mozambique and South Africa. We will be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end, unless there is a significant and profound change in American life and policy.
Dr. Martin Luther King, April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church here in New York. We now turn to Dr. Vincent Harding, the man who wrote that speech for King. He was a close friend, a neighbor, a colleague. He is now Professor Emeritus of Religion and Social Transformation at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado, author of many books, including Martin Luther King, The Inconvenient Hero. I asked Dr. Harding where he was at the time he heard about Dr. King's shooting.
I was sitting with my wife and a friend from New York, Wilfred Cordy, at the famous Pascal's Motel and Restaurant in Atlanta. And the three of us were having dinner that evening. And the owner of Pascal's came over to me, whispered in my ear the first word that had come about Martin being shot. And that's where I was, and that's where I will never forget being.
And your thoughts at that time? You didn't even know he was dead at that point.
No. But I was very worried that that is what might be taking place. And my wife and Freddie and I just began to talk about the significance of it. I don't remember anything about what we said. I do remember the jolt that it was to me at the time. And then as the word began to go around the restaurant, it was clear that there was something passing through all of us who were in that restaurant at the time.
You had known Dr. King for 10 years.
Yes.
You met him in '58?
Yes.
How did you meet him?
Oh, it's a long, long story, Amy. But let me see if I can be unusual and say that 5 of us who were members of an interracial church in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, Woodlawn Mennonite Church, had decided that we wanted to really test out our own convictions about brotherhood, as we termed it then. 3 white, 2 black, got into an old station wagon and started out in Little Rock, Arkansas, to drive across the South to pledge to each other that we would not allow ourselves to be separated, because we believed deeply that we were brothers in some God-given way. And as we were driving, we came into Alabama, and it was clear to us that we shouldn't be in Alabama without seeing Martin King. And so in those days of non-cell phones,